The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the battlefield. Smoke and dust swirled through the air, the remnants of a fierce fight between two enemy factions. The ground was littered with abandoned weapons, broken vehicles, and the twisted remains of fallen soldiers. Among the chaos, a young soldier named Michael carefully moved forward, his rifle steady in his hands. He had been in many battles before, but this one felt different. The sound of gunfire and explosions had become so familiar that they almost blended into the background, but today something was off. The air seemed heavier, more suffocating. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something beyond the fighting he was used to. As Michael crouched behind a broken wall for cover, he heard a faint sound, a cry, high-pitched and full of terror. His heart skipped a beat. The sound didn't belong in the chaos of war. It was the sound of a child, desperate and scared. Without thinking, he quickly scanned the area, his eyes searching the smoke-filled horizon. He could barely make out the figure of a small child stumbling through the dust, her clothes torn and dirty. Michael hesitated for only a second before pushing himself up and running toward her. He knew it was risky. The enemy's forces were closing in on their position, and anyone caught in the open was a target. But in that moment, all he could think of was the child. No one, no matter who they were or which side they fought for, deserved to be left alone in a war zone. The girl didn't seem to notice him until he was almost right next to her. Her wide eyes locked onto his, and she froze as though paralyzed by fear. Michael didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbing her hand firmly but gently, and yanked her towards him. "Come on, we have to move," he shouted, his voice steady, despite the panic rising in his chest. The sound of enemy soldiers getting closer only pushed him to move faster. Michael knew that if he didn't act now, the girl wouldn't have a chance. As he sprinted through the chaos, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath him. The blast was so close it sent a shockwave that almost knocked him off his feet. His body instinctively shielded the girl, wrapping his arms around her protectively as he shielded her from the debris that flew through the air. The world seemed to slow down for a moment as dust and smoke clouded everything. His ears rang from the explosion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He forced his legs to move faster, every step a battle against the overwhelming weight of his body and the girl's small form in his arms. He had no plan, no backup, and no clear escape route. His only goal was to get her to safety. The world seemed to collapse around them as they stumbled through the wreckage of a broken city. They passed burning cars, shattered windows, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Michael didn't look back, didn't take the time to process what was happening. His focus was on one thing only, the girl in his arms. Her small body was trembling against his chest, and he could feel her heart racing beneath her ragged breaths. She was terrified, and he didn't blame her. War did that to people. It made them lose everything they knew, everything they loved. But he had to get her out of here. He had to make sure she survived. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael found a hidden alcove between two buildings, a small patch of shelter from the battle that still raged outside. He ducked down, pulling the girl behind him, and they both collapsed to the ground out of sight. The air was thick with the smell of burning debris, but it was quieter here. For the first time since the chaos had begun, Michael allowed himself a breath. The girl, still clinging to his side, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was no older than 7 or 8. Her face was streaked with dirt, and her clothes were torn from the blast. But she was alive. Michael could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something that spoke of a life torn apart by war. He didn't know why he had done it, why he had risked his life to save a child who wasn't even his own. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, as though she knew he was her only hope. Maybe it was the instinct that told him to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. Or maybe it was just the fact that in the middle of all this destruction, he had been given a chance to do something good. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice softer now as he kneeled beside her. He didn't expect an answer. She was still too shaken, too afraid to speak. But her small hand reached out to him, her fingers trembling as they grasped his sleeve. Michael looked out over the battlefield, the distant sounds of gunfire still echoing in the distance. He knew this wasn't over. There would be more battles to fight, more lives to lose. But in this moment, as he looked down at the girl he had saved, he realized something important. He didn't care which side she was on. He didn't care about the war. He had made a choice, and it wasn't about loyalty to his country, his comrades, or his enemies. It was about protecting a life that still had the chance to be saved. "Don't worry," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to keep you safe." The sounds of war were still close, echoing in the distance like a constant reminder that the world outside hadn't stopped. Michael sat against the wall, his back pressed against the cold, cracked stone. The girl, still trembling, sat beside him, her tiny body curled up as if trying to make herself as small as possible. She hadn't said a word since he pulled her into the shelter. Michael wondered if she even had the strength to speak. The smoke from the explosion still clung to the air, the acrid scent of burning metal mixing with the dust and the bitter taste of fear. Michael wiped his forehead, trying to focus. He could hear the distant cries of soldiers, the thumping of boots on gravel, but none of that mattered right now. Right now it was just the two of them, hiding in this broken city that had once been home to so many. "Are you hungry?" Michael asked, his voice rough from the dust. He didn't expect a response. The girl didn't even look up at him. She just nodded silently. She was in shock, Michael could tell. He had seen it before in other soldiers, but never in someone so young. War did this to people. It tore them apart, broke their spirits, and left them with nothing but scars. Michael pulled out a small ration pack from his bag, tearing it open with his teeth. The food wasn't great, but it was all he had. He handed it to her, but she didn't take it. Instead, she just stared at the package in his hands, her eyes empty, her face pale. Michael felt a pang in his chest. It wasn't just hunger that gripped her. It was something deeper, something that had to do with the war she had been born into. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there, watching her slowly fall apart. "You need to eat," he said gently, offering the ration pack again. "It's not much, but it will help." She slowly reached out, her small hand trembling as she took it. Michael watched her as she ate, her movements slow, almost mechanical. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that he would keep her safe, but he didn't know if he believed it himself. The war wasn't over, and no matter how much he wanted to protect her, there was no guarantee that he could. As they sat there in the silence, Michael's mind wandered to his comrades. He had left them behind to save this child, and he could already feel the weight of their judgment. He had always believed in the cause, had always trusted that what he was fighting for was right. But this was different. In saving this child, he had crossed a line. He wasn't sure if he could go back to the way things were, if he could just pretend that everything was still the same. And then there was the question of what to do next. How long could he keep this girl hidden? He had no supplies left, no way to know if anyone would come looking for them. And if they did, if his own side found out he had protected the enemy's child, they wouldn't hesitate to see him as a traitor. He looked down at the girl again. She had finished eating, but she didn't seem to be in any better shape. She sat quietly, her eyes blank, staring at nothing. Michael couldn't blame her for the way she was. She had seen too much, far more than any child should ever have to endure. Suddenly, he heard a noise, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching, on the ground, coming closer. Michael's heart raced. The last thing he needed right now was for the enemy to find them. He pulled the girl close, pressing her down behind the wall, his hand over her mouth to silence her. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't let them find her. He had already risked his life for this child, but he wasn't ready to give it all up just yet. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were almost at the corner of the building. Michael's hand tightened around the girl's wrist, his muscles tensing. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to run, but there was nowhere to go. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this. He knew that if he was caught, both he and the girl would be finished. The footsteps stopped just around the corner. Michael could feel the heat of his breath in his chest, his pulse hammering in his ears. He dared not move, not even a muscle. The girl was shaking beside him, her eyes wide with fear. The seconds seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Michael could hear the sound of a rifle being shifted, the rustle of fabric as someone adjusted their position. He pressed himself closer to the wall, holding his breath. If they discovered them now, there would be no escape. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound of footsteps began to fade. The soldiers had passed by without noticing them. Michael let out a slow, silent breath, his body relaxing only slightly. He looked at the girl, her wide eyes still filled with fear. He gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't feel convincing. "We're okay," he whispered. "They're gone?" The girl nodded, though she didn't seem comforted. She was still too shaken, too frightened to trust that they were safe. Michael didn't blame her. He didn't feel safe either. Not really. They sat there for what felt like hours, just waiting. Michael couldn't stop thinking about what would happen next. If they stayed here too long, they risked being found. But if they moved, they risked running straight into the enemy's hands. He needed to find a way to get her to safety, but he had no idea how. The night was starting to fall, the city growing darker with each passing minute. Michael knew that time was running out. He couldn't stay here forever. The girl was depending on him now, and he had to figure out what to do. He had promised to protect her, and that promise was something he couldn't break. But how could he protect her when there was nowhere to hide? The night had settled into an eerie stillness. The sounds of the battle were distant now, but they were still there, lurking just beyond the horizon. Michael could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The girl, Ilara, was still sitting beside him, her eyes wide and distant. She hadn't spoken since their close call earlier, and Michael wasn't sure if she even had the strength left to speak. He sat on the cold ground, trying to think of their next move. The walls of the ruined building they had taken shelter in seemed to close in around him. He couldn't stay here forever, but he also couldn't risk moving her without a plan. If they ran into enemy soldiers again, they wouldn't get lucky. A second time. The weight of his choices was starting to crush him. He had saved her life, but now he was responsible for her. His actions had drawn the enemy's attention, and if they found out he was hiding her, there would be no mercy. But he couldn't just leave her. Not now. Not after everything. As the hours dragged on, Michael's mind raced with thoughts of escape. He knew the area well. He had fought here before. There were secret routes, hidden paths through the city that could get them out, but they would be dangerous. Every step outside this building was a risk. The enemy had eyes everywhere. He stood up slowly, trying not to wake Ilara. She had curled up against the wall and was finally resting, her tiny body still tense, but at least she wasn't shaking as much. Michael's heart ached for her. She was so small, so fragile. In a world like this, she should never have had to grow up like this. "Stay here, Ilara," he whispered softly, as if she could understand every word. He didn't want to leave her alone, but he had to check the surroundings. He needed to be sure they weren't walking straight into danger if they tried to leave. He stepped cautiously toward the broken window, peering out into the night. The city was a maze of wreckage, the streets littered with debris and the remnants of once proud buildings. The distant glow of fires illuminated the horizon, casting an orange hue across the jagged skyline. The war wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. And Michael knew that if he didn't get Ilara out of here soon, they would be caught in the middle of it. But then, something else caught his attention. He heard a voice, low and calm, almost too calm. It sent a chill down his spine. Michael quickly crouched down, moving back from the window and into the shadows. The voice was distant, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the alleyway just outside. His heart pounded faster. He had been hoping for some time to think, but now everything was happening too quickly. They had to move. Michael moved swiftly back to Ilara's side, crouching beside her, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the building. "Ilara," he whispered urgently. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. "We need to go." Now. She blinked her eyes open, slowly, clearly confused, still lost in the fog of exhaustion and fear. Michael gently shook her, trying not to alarm her. We have to leave now. We don't have much time. Alara's eyes were wide with fear, and for a moment she looked at him as though she didn't understand. Michael tried his best to offer a reassuring smile, even though his own heart was racing. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her up. She hesitated at first, her small body stiff with reluctance, but eventually she allowed him to guide her forward. Michael led her quietly through the dark hallway, trying to stay as low as possible. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. Everything was moving too fast for words. All that mattered was getting her to safety. The alleyway outside was empty. Michael peered around the corner, scanning for any sign of movement. The quiet was almost worse than the noise of battle. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable. He didn't know who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to make a wrong move. There's a path ahead, Michael whispered, pointing down a narrow, broken road that led toward a series of ruins. The path wasn't much, but it was better than staying in one place. He didn't know where it would lead, but it was better than being caught. He pulled Alara along with him, his steps as silent as possible. His senses were sharp, every sound magnified in the stillness. Cat's rustle in the garbage, the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Everything had his full attention. He didn't dare let his guard down. They moved quickly, their feet crunching on the broken ground. Michael's mind raced with thoughts of escape. Could they make it out of the city? Was there any safe place left? He had no answers, but he wasn't about to give up. Not when Alara was depending on him. They reached a collapsed building, an old structure that had once been a bustling market square. Now, it was nothing more than rubble. Michael crouched down, pulling Alara behind a large piece of concrete. The night air was cold against his skin, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could still hear voices in the distance. Soldiers, he thought, searching for something, maybe even for them. He held his breath, listening. The voices were getting closer. His chest tightened and his mind raced. If they were discovered here, it would be over. There was no way out. Suddenly a hand touched his shoulder, making him jump. His heart leaped into his throat, but when he turned, he saw a familiar face. It was one of his comrades, a soldier he had known for years. Michael's first instinct was relief, but it quickly turned to fear. If his comrade was here, it could mean only one thing. They had found him. They had discovered what he had done. The soldier looked at him with wide, shocked eyes. "Michael, what have you done?" he whispered harshly. Michael started to explain, but words failed him. What could he say? How could he justify his actions? The soldier didn't wait for an answer, his eyes flicking to Alara, who was hiding behind Michael. "She's just a child," Michael said softly, though he wasn't sure if it was meant for the soldier or himself. "I couldn't leave her." His comrade looked around nervously, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was watching. "You need to get out of here now. The commander is looking for you. He wants answers." Michael's heart sank. There was no turning back now. They were running out of time. Michael's heart was still racing as he stood in the shadow of the ruined building, looking at his comrade. The soldier's eyes flickered nervously between him and Alara. The air between them was thick with tension. Michael had always been able to rely on his comrades. He had fought beside them for years, but now everything felt different. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The words felt heavy in his mouth. The soldier lowered his voice, glancing around the corner as though expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. "You've put us all in danger, Michael. The commander's orders were clear. No mercy, no exceptions." He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "But you saved a child." Michael felt the weight of the soldier's words sink into his chest. There was no escaping the truth. He had gone against his orders, and now there were consequences. But even so, Michael wasn't sorry. Not for Alara. He had saved her life, and he wouldn't regret that. I couldn't just let her die, Michael said, his voice stronger now. She's innocent. She didn't start this war. I couldn't leave her there. The soldier didn't reply immediately. He just looked at Michael, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and pity. You have to get out of here, Michael. They're looking for you, looking for both of you. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, lowering his voice even further. They won't stop until they find you. Michael nodded, his mind racing. He knew the enemy was looking for them, but now his own side was too. There was no safe place left. He couldn't stay here, not with Alara. His decision had already put him on a path he couldn't turn back from. We need to move, Michael whispered to Alara, who was still huddled behind him, clutching his sleeve tightly. He wanted to shield her from the truth, from the harsh reality of what was happening. She didn't need to hear the conversation. She just needed safety. The soldier looked at Michael one last time, his face hardening with resolve. You'll need to head north, toward the old docks. It's the only place you'll be safe for now. He hesitated. Take this, he said, reaching into his bag and pulling out a small, weathered map. He handed it to Michael, his eyes filled with urgency. It'll show you the safest route. Michael took the map, nodding grimly. Thank you. The soldier gave him one last look before turning away, disappearing into the night. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't have time to think. He had to move. He had to protect Alara, and he had to get her to safety. Come on, Michael said softly, kneeling beside her. We're going to get you out of here. Alara didn't speak, but she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. She nodded, and together they began their journey into the night. The road to the old docks wasn't easy. The map the soldier had given him was old, and the streets were unfamiliar. But Michael pushed forward, his steps quick and purposeful. The moonlight barely cut through the thick clouds, and the city around them seemed like a maze of shadows and broken buildings. Every time they passed a corner, Michael's heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was waiting to spring a trap. His hand gripped Alara's tightly, trying to reassure her, but deep down, he was terrified. They moved quickly through the dark streets, slipping between ruined buildings and alleyways. The air was thick with dust, and the city felt like a ghost town. The sounds of war had faded, but that didn't mean they were safe. Michael couldn't stop looking over his shoulder, checking every shadow for movement. He had learned long ago that in war, nothing was ever as it seemed. As they neared the docks, Michael spotted a small boat at the edge of the water. It looked abandoned, the paint peeling, but it was a chance to escape. He looked at Alara, who was still walking beside him, her eyes wide with fear but also with a glimmer of hope. We're almost there, Michael whispered, trying to give her some comfort. He had to keep moving forward. There was no turning back. When they reached the boat, Michael carefully helped Alara aboard, his hands shaking slightly. He untied the ropes holding the boat to the dock and pushed off gently. The boat creaked as it moved through the dark water. But Michael didn't care. He wasn't going to look back anymore. As they drifted further from the shore, Michael allowed himself a moment to breathe. The city was behind them now. The war, the chaos, it was all behind them. He didn't know where they were headed, but it didn't matter. For the first time in days, Michael felt a small flicker of hope. But then, a distant sound reached his ears, the faint hum of an engine. It was soft, but it was there. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, his eyes scanning the water. He couldn't see anything, but the sound was growing louder. He knew what it was. A patrol. They had found him. Get down, he hissed at Alara, pulling her low to the bottom of the boat. He crouched beside her, his hand on the side of the boat, ready to push them into the water if needed. The engine noise grew louder, and Michael's pulse quickened. He didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. But he wasn't going to give up now, not when they were so close. The boat drifted silently across the water, its movement barely noticeable against the soft ripples of the dark river. Michael's hands gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white with tension. Every nerve in his body was on high alert. He had to focus. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Alara was crouched beside him, her small body curled up in a tight ball, her eyes wide with fear. Michael could feel the tremble in her body as she clutched his sleeve, but she was silent. She had been silent for a long time now, as though she had learned to hold her fear inside, to bury it beneath the surface. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer now. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He knew that the patrol was coming. It was only a matter of time before they saw the boat. The only question was whether they could outrun them. Michael looked at the shoreline. The trees and bushes along the riverbank blurred in the distance. He didn't know where this river led, but he had to keep moving forward. The further they got from the city, the better. The patrol would have a harder time finding them if they kept moving. Alara's grip on his sleeve tightened, and Michael looked down at her. She was trembling, but there was something else in her eyes now. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something stronger. It was a sense of trust, a trust that he had earned, even if it hadn't been easy. Michael reached out and gently stroked her hair. "We're going to be okay," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but he had to say it. For her. For both of them. The engine sound was growing louder now, just behind them. Michael could hear the faint hum of the patrol boat's engine, its steady rhythm growing closer with every passing second. Suddenly, a sharp light flashed across the water, cutting through the darkness. Michael froze, his breath caught in his throat. The patrol boat had seen them. There was no escape now. The spotlight swung across the water, illuminating the boat, and Michael's heart sank. They had been spotted. "Stay down," Michael hissed, pushing Alara lower in the boat. He grabbed the paddle and began to row furiously, his muscles straining against the weight of the water. He could hear the patrol boat coming closer, its engine roaring as it picked up speed. The spotlight swept across the boat again, blinding Michael for a moment. He couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. Alara was depending on him. He rowed faster, his heart pounding in his chest. The patrol boat was gaining on them, the sound of its engine like a drumbeat in his ears. Michael's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of escape, but there was nowhere to go. The river stretched on endlessly, its dark waters reflecting the cold, empty sky. As the patrol boat drew closer, Michael could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to make a choice. There was no way out unless he took a risk. "Hold on," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. He turned the boat sharply, aiming for a narrow stretch of the river where the water seemed to split in two. It was risky, too risky, but it was their only chance. The boat lurched as Michael paddled with all his strength, trying to steer them into the narrow path. The patrol boat followed closely behind, the spotlight fixed on them. Just as Michael thought they wouldn't make it, the boat shot forward into the narrow gap. The patrol boat's engine roared behind them, but it was too big to follow into the narrow channel. They had made it. For now.